Welcome to the Warwick Words Digital History Festival. I'm Paula Fletcher, and this is a short introduction to some of the history of West Street and the western suburbs of Warwick. West Street is the main artery that runs from the West Country and also from the M40 into Warwick itself. And in 1936, there was a lovely book written by a man called Arthur Mee, and it was called The King's England Warwickshire, and it covers all the towns and villages of Warwickshire. And I would like to read to you the starting sentences of what it says about Warwick, which I think is as relevant today as it was in 1936 when the book was published. Warwick. It is the county town of the Shakespeare country, and it is a beauty. Let him who would feel the thrill of England come here. Not in all England are more historic interest and beauty crowded into so small a space. Isn't that wonderful? From around 1600, the form of the medieval suburb of West Street has persisted until the present day with remarkably few changes. The line of small dwellings at each side of the road going towards Stratford terminated at the site of St. Lawrence's Chapel, now demolished, which stood opposite where the Tudor Inn and the Vine Inn are now located. Many of the houses still remain to make the most picturesque approach to the town along tree-lined pavements, and the steep incline towards Westgate gives some idea of Warwick's defensive strength in the past. West Street in 1830 was described as wide and airy, consisting of houses inhabited by the working classes of the community. 2 centuries earlier, in the 1600s, the hearth tax returns, that's how many fireplaces were in each house, confirm the impression of small houses, the average being under 2 hearths per house, and 55 houses were not liable to the tax at all, so it must have been extremely cold. In 1774 and 1777, George Greville, Earl of Warwick, extended his castle grounds, depriving the inhabitants of West Street their previous access to the River Avon, which had been via Watercart Lane, now Castle Lane, and Sanders Row, now Leicester Place. The houses on the south side of West Street became sandwiched between the road and the castle gardens, though further from the town, long, narrow gardens extended from some houses to the castle park. To the north, the area between West Street and Friars Street was first developed in the early 19th century, and further development took place in Hampton Road in the early years of the 20th century. A cricket field was established in 1904, and more expansion took place after the Second World War in the 1950s. Aylesford School was built, and in the 1960s and 70s, more housing development took place to the south of West Street, behind existing houses against the castle park. No tour of West Street would be complete without a mention of the town's West Gate, not strengthened against invaders, but against medieval black marketeers, and also to assist in tax collecting. Think of the town as being a supermarket, and this gate was the checkout, where they added their medieval VAT. Westgate was also known as the Hanging Gate, a combination church, toll house, and gibbet. The chapel of St. James the Great would have been full of monks endlessly chanting Latin Mass, and outside the roughly chopped up corpses of the executed would have certainly deterred the most ardent criminals from committing crime in the town of Warwick. Nestled against remnants of the old medieval town walls are the Westgate almshouses. The Guilds of Warwick included amongst its charitable work the support of 8 poor women who were said to have been housed in part of the guild buildings, now the Lord Leicester Hospital. It is not clear how these almswomen were maintained after the guilds were dissolved, but by 1582 they were receiving parish relief. In the next century, the Priory estate provided a quarterly payment of 34 shillings and 8 pence and a clothing allowance administered by the Bailiff of Warwick and the Vicar of St. Mary's. By 1883, 8 widows lived in 4 houses. 2 received half a crown, that's 2 shillings and 6 pence in old money, a quarter, and 6 received 13 pence. And bearing in mind the house's proximity to the gibbet, these women must have been made of stern stuff in earlier days, because you open your front door and the smell must have been pretty awful from those rotting corpses. And then think of the flies. Ugh. In 1888, the Mrs. Louisa and Julia Harris financed the demolition of the old almshouses, which were in very poor condition, and had built the ones that stand here today. There is a plaque on the building which reads, "For the love of God and in memory of their mother, Louisa Harris, these almshouses were rebuilt by her daughters, Louisa H. and Julia Harris, AD 1889. So who were the Harris family? Well, their mother, Louisa Harris, was the widow of Henry Berners Shelley Harris, who had been the master of the Lord Leicester Hospital. In the census records, the family are there in 1851, having moved from Essex. Henry Harris is still the master in 1861, but Julia, one of the daughters, and Philip, a son, are staying with an aunt and uncle on their mother's side, William D.C. Brooke, baronet and magistrate living in Leicestershire. According to this same census, Philip Harris is 23 and of no profession. However, by 1871, he is master of the Lord Leicester Hospital, and his mother and his two sisters, Louisa H. and Julia, are also living there with him. And apparently the masters of the Lord Leicester Hospital at that time lived in some style, with servants and carriages and so forth. Henry Harris died in 1863, and his estate is listed as no more than £18,000. That's about £2.25 million spending money today. Louisa died in 1865, and her personal estate was valued at £27,905, 8 shillings and 3pence, which today would be worth about £3.5 million. So no wonder her two pious daughters could afford to rebuild these splendid almshouses in her name. Looking across the road is a building originally called the Malt Shovel Inn. The Malt Shovel became residences in 1905, but it was listed as a pub right up until 1849. It's a former coaching inn, and the large porch-like projection suggests the building may have originated circa 1630, if not earlier. Warwick has always been a town of drinkers. Let's face it, water at one time could kill you, and people drank beer, ale, and wine. In fact, at one time, there was one pub for every 14 of the population in Warwick. And here on West Street in 1910, there were many pubs, 8 to 10 at any one time. You could take your pick of the Bull's Head, the Unicorn Inn, the Nelson Inn, the Rising Sun, the Mermaid Inn, the Wheat Chief, the White Horse, and the Vine. And that's not counting the Tudor, which became a pub a little later, the Malt Shovel, by then turned into dwellings, and the Rising Sun, also known as the Manchester Arms, which became a very well-known shop here in Warwick called Torres. But it certainly must have been a lively time on West Street with all those pubs. But why a pub called the Mermaid Inn so far from the coast? Well, dolphins and mermaids have always been known as the kings and queens of the sea, and pilgrims carried talismans, small ornaments fashioned in the likeness of mermaids and dolphins, with them as they travelled the land. And it could be suggested that West Street, with its Blackfriars Priory located nearby, could have been a well-worn pilgrim route in earlier days. On the corner of West Street and Bowling Green Street lies Blackfriars House. Centuries ago, there was a Blackfriars Priory founded in this area in 1260 by Ralph Beautrelet, 1st Baron of Wem. Nothing now remains of their presence except the names of the streets, all lying north of West Street. At the turn of the 19th century, Warwick was growing, and growing fast, and this was due to the Birmingham and Warwick Canal, built with the benevolent help of the Birmingham Canal Navigations Authority and the Earl of Warwick, who was a strong supporter of bringing the canal to Warwick. And an Act of Parliament to build the canal was passed in March 1793. It authorised a canal from the Digbeth branch of the Birmingham Canal, where there was to be a stop lock, for 22 miles to Warwick and from Digbeth the line rose by 6 locks to Bawdsley at its summit, which it maintained for around 10 miles to Knowle, where there are 6 falling locks. From there, the canal ran through the Shrewley Tunnel, 433 yards to the top of the Hatton Flight of 21 locks, not far from which at the bottom was the end at Saltersford Wharf in Warwick. The canal ceremoniously opened on the 18th of December 1799, and after final work was completed, trading began on the 19th of March 1800. The opening of the canal enabled many new industries to open in the area of the Saltersford. A cotton mill was erected in 1795. The gasworks erected in 1822, one of the first gasworks in the world, and it was here in Warwick. A business that became Eagle Engineering, owned by Joseph Brookhouse, who partnered with William Parks and William Crompton in a worsted manufacturing business at the Saltersford, which opened in 1792. There was also a coal merchant who stabled his horses on the site, and a brewery. And all these businesses and many more, and all the people who worked there, were there because of the promise and fulfilment of the Birmingham to Warwick arm of the canal. The workforce was housed in the newly erected street in the western parts of the town on the north side of West Street. The names of the new streets recalled not only the former Dominican Friary, Friars Court, Monk Street, Chapel Court, but also the contemporary Warwick industrialists whose workers were housed there, Crompton Street, Woodhouse Street, to name but 2. By 1851, this development had completely absorbed the land between West Street and the Lammas lands. Closely packed houses were freely interspersed with inns and skittle alleys, adding to the public houses already here on West Street. And as the population grew, the churchyards of St Mary's and St Nicholas became full. And in 1823, both churches petitioned the Bishop of Worcester for extra burial space. As a result, on the 23rd of July 1824, ground was consecrated in Friars Street, and later in the same year, a cemetery chapel was built. This was known as St Mary's Episcopal Chapel, being served by St Mary's and used exclusively for burials. And also in 1824, it was proposed that a new free Anglican church should be built, and 2 years later, the parish of St Paul's was formed out of the western part of St Mary's parish, which embraced the original cemetery chapel. The church was completed the same year at a cost of £3,500, with stone given by the Earl of Warwick, and it was consecrated on the 26th of July 1844 by the Bishop of Worcester. And so we return to Blackfriars House. Records show a building on this site as far back as 1482, but this beautiful Grade II listed Georgian home, built in 1781, was originally called Moss House. The house became the vicarage to the newly built church of St Paul's, and I would imagine that possibly this may be the time that the name of the house was changed to Blackfriars House. The first resident was a Reverend Smith and his wife Frances, and I believe their 5 children. And the last vicar was a Reverend Geoffrey Dingle from 1960 to 1966, when Blackfriars House ceased to be the vicarage and it was moved to the Stratford Road. This was the time when the Coventry Diocese Church Commissioners sold the building, and its most recent owner is the Monkey Puzzle Children's Day Nursery, who purchased the building in 2010, and it opened in 2011. The house still maintains a beautiful landscape garden at the rear, which I am sure was lovingly tended by many a vicar and many a vicar's wife who resided there in the past. And I'm afraid we're now out of time. And I hope you've enjoyed learning a little about West Street and the western suburbs, and maybe next year you'll be able to take a walk with me to discover more about the buildings and the history of West Street. Until then, stay safe, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this virtual Warwick Words History Festival. Goodbye.